Colorado, 1873, the flames leapt skyward, consuming everything in their path. The dry timber of the Chandler farmhouse crackled and groaned as fire devoured the life Sarah Mae Chandler had known. She knelt beside her father's bed, clutching his frail hand. The smoke curled around them, thickening with each passing second. "Go, Sarah," her father whispered, his voice barely audible above the roar of the inferno. His eyes, sunken with illness, fixed on hers with unexpected clarity. "Save yourself." "I won't leave you," she insisted, though she knew there was nothing she could do. The doctor had given him days, perhaps hours, before the fire had even started. The cancer had hollowed him out, leaving only determination where his strength had once been. Samuel Chandler squeezed her hand with surprising force. "Listen to me, child. You are the last of us." His breath rattled in his chest. "Promise me. Promise you'll keep the Chandler name alive. Don't let our blood die with me." Sarah's throat tightened. "I promise, Father." "Now go," he commanded, releasing her hand. "Take the Bible. It's all that matters now." Sarah hesitated, tears streaming down her face before reaching for the family Bible on the bedside table. The leather-bound volume contained generations of Chandler history, births, deaths, marriages, all carefully recorded in her grandmother's elegant script. The last entry had been her mother's death 3 years prior. The roof beams groaned ominously overhead. She bent to kiss her father's forehead one last time. "I love you," she whispered. "I know," he said, eyes closing. "Now live, Sarah. Live for us all." She fled, clutching the Bible to her chest as the ceiling began to collapse. The heat scorched her lungs, and she stumbled out the front door just as the roof caved in behind her with a deafening crash. Standing in the yard, she watched helplessly as flames consumed the only home she had ever known, along with her father's body and every possession she had in the world. Sarah sank to her knees in the dirt, the family Bible clutched to her breast, and wept beneath a cold, indifferent scapegoat. 3 days later, Sarah staggered through unfamiliar wilderness, her strength nearly gone. The meager provisions she'd salvaged from the barn hadn't lasted long. The thin shawl wrapped around her shoulders offered little protection against the biting cold of early winter. Her once fine boots were cracked and worn, and her dress, the only one she now owned, was stained with soot in travel. She had been following what she hoped was a trail, but as darkness fell and fat snowflakes began to swirl around her, Sarah feared she had made a fatal error. No one knew she was here. No one would look for her. She was utterly alone. A howl pierced the gathering gloom. Close, too close. Another answered, and then another. Wolves. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She scanned the landscape desperately for shelter, but there was nothing except scattered pines and the looming shadow of the mountains. The first wolf appeared at the edge of the trees, lean and gray, its yellow eyes gleaming with hunger. Others materialized beside it, their bodies sleek shadows in the fading light. Sarah backed away, slowly clutching the Bible like a shield. The lead wolf snarled, saliva dripping from its jaws, and crouched to spring. Sarah closed her eyes, a silent prayer on her lips, when the sharp crack of a rifle split the air. The wolf yelped and fell while the rest of the pack scattered into the darkness. "Don't move," a deep voice commanded. Sarah opened her eyes to see a man astride a massive black horse rifle still raised. He was enormous, well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad as an axe handle and a face weathered by sun and wind. Dark hair fell to his collar, and his beard was neatly trimmed despite his frontier appearance. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, gray as storm clouds and just as turbulent. "Are you hurt?" he asked, lowering the rifle. No," Sarah managed, though her voice trembled with cold and fear. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, revealing his true size. He approached cautiously as if she were a skittish animal that might bolt. "You're half frozen." He observed, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Where did you come from?" "Cedar Creek," she whispered. "Our farm." "That's 20 miles south of here." He frowned. "You walked all that way?" Sarah nodded, suddenly lightheaded. The world tilted sideways, and she would have fallen if the stranger hadn't caught her arm. "My Bible," she murmured, clutching it tighter. "I won't take it," he assured her. "But you need shelter before this storm hits proper. My place is just over that ridge." She hesitated, remembering her mother's warnings about strange men. But the howls of the wolves still echoed through the trees, and the snow was falling faster now. "I have nowhere else to go," she admitted. The man nodded once, accepting her decision without comment. He helped her mount his horse before climbing up behind her. His arms formed a solid barrier on either side as he took the reins, and Sarah felt an unexpected sense of security within their circle. "I'm Sarah," she offered as they began to move. "Sarah Mae Chandler." A pause, then Caleb Stone. They rode in silence after that, the horse picking its way carefully through the gathering snow. Sarah fought to stay conscious, but exhaustion and hunger pulled at her, and she found herself leaning back against the solid warmth of the stranger's chest. The last thing she remembered was the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her spine before darkness claimed her. Sarah awoke to the crackle of a fire and the rich aroma of something cooking. She lay on a narrow bed beneath several warm quilts, her boots removed and a clean bandage wrapped around her ankle where she'd twisted it during her journey. The family Bible rested on a small table beside her. She pushed herself upright, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles, and took in her surroundings. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from outside, a single spacious room with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. Everything was meticulously clean and organized, from the copper pots hanging near the cook stove to the books lining the shelves beside the window. Caleb Stone stood at the stove, his back to her, stirring something in a cast-iron pot. He'd removed his coat, and she could see the powerful muscles of his shoulders and back beneath his flannel shirt. Despite his size, he moved with unexpected grace, like a man completely at ease in his own space. Near the fireplace sat a rocking chair that drew Sarah's eye immediately. It was beautifully crafted with intricate scrollwork on the arms and back. A small cushion covered in faded blue fabric rested on the seat, and the wood gleamed with the patina of careful maintenance. Yet something about it suggested it was rarely used, a shrine rather than a functional piece of furniture. "You're awake," Caleb said, turning to face her. In the firelight, his features seemed less severe, though no less imposing. "How long was I asleep?" Sarah asked, her voice hoarse. "Almost a full day." He poured something from the pot into a bowl. "You need to eat." He brought the bowl to her, a simple stew of beef and vegetables that smelled like heaven after days of near starvation. Sarah accepted it gratefully, trying not to devour it too quickly despite her hunger. "Thank you," she said between careful spoonfuls, "for saving me from the wolves and for—" She gestured, vaguely encompassing the food, the shelter, the bandaged ankle. Caleb nodded, settling into a chair across from the bed. "What happened at Cedar Creek? There's been no word of trouble." Sarah's hand stilled the spoon halfway to her mouth. "My father died. Our farm burned the same night." The words came out flat, emotionless. She couldn't afford the luxury of grief, not yet. "I'm sorry," he said, and there was something in his voice that had suggested he understood loss intimately. He'd been sick for months. The doctor said it was only a matter of time. She set the spoon down, her appetite suddenly diminished despite her hunger. "I was going to sell the farm, maybe go back to teaching in Boston, but then the fire—" She trailed off, unwilling to relive those moments. "You were a teacher," Sarah nodded, "for 3 years before my mother fell ill. I came home to care for her, and then when father's heart started failing—" She shrugged, the gesture encompassing all the dreams she'd set aside for duty. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those storm-gray eyes. "The snow's coming down hard," he said finally. "Trails will be impassable for a few days at least. You can stay until it clears." "And then?" Sarah asked, hearing the edge of desperation in her own voice. "That's up to you," he said. "Nearest town is Willow Creek, about 10 miles west. They might need a teacher." Sarah looked around the cabin at the solitary bed she currently occupied and felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Where have you been sleeping?" "By the fire," he said, nodding toward a bedroll neatly stowed in the corner. "I've slept in worse places." She studied him, this mountain of a man who had saved her life and offered shelter without expectation. A wild, desperate idea began to form in her mind, an answer to her father's final request and her current predicament in one unlikely package. "Mr. Stone," she said, setting the half-finished stew aside and straightening her spine, "I'd like to propose an arrangement." His eyebrows rose slightly, but he said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "I have no money, no family, nowhere to go," she said bluntly. "Winter is coming, and I won't survive on my own. You live here alone with more work than one person can reasonably manage." She took a deep breath. "Give me a home, Mr. Stone, and I'll give you 10 sons." Caleb's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or wariness. That's a bold offer from a woman who's known me less than a day. Desperate times call for desperate measures, she replied, lifting her chin. I come from good stock. My grandmother bore 12 children, all healthy. I'm strong, educated, and willing to work. I can cook, clean, tend animals, garden. I won't be a burden. And the 10 sons? His voice was carefully neutral. A man with a spread this size needs hands to work it, she said practically. Sons who will carry your name and inherit what you've built. She didn't mention her promise to her father. That was her private burden. Caleb rose from his chair and moved to the window, staring out at the swirling snow. You're offering marriage, he said, his back to her. I'm offering partnership, Sarah corrected, a mutually beneficial arrangement. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Marriage isn't just a business transaction, Miss Chandler. No, she agreed softly, but it can begin as one and become something more given time. And if it doesn't, then we'll have security, companionship, and a family to show for our efforts. She met his gaze steadily. There are worse foundations for a life together. Caleb studied her for a long moment, his face giving nothing away. Then he moved to the stove and filled a bowl for himself. Finish your stew, he said. We can talk more when you've regained your strength. Sarah recognized the dismissal but felt no disappointment. He hadn't refused outright, which meant he was considering her proposal. She picked up her spoon and continued eating, watching surreptitiously as he sat at the table and began his own meal. Who was this solitary man, and what shadows lurked behind those storm cloud eyes? What had happened to the woman who had once sat in that carefully maintained rocking chair? These were questions for another time. For now she had shelter, food, and the faintest glimmer of hope. More than she'd had yesterday, and perhaps enough to face tomorrow. In the days that followed, Sarah's strength returned gradually. The snow continued to fall, transforming the landscape into a pristine white wilderness and making any thought of departure impossible. Caleb kept to himself, spending much of his time in the barn, tending to his livestock, or at his workbench, crafting items for the farm with skilled hands. Sarah occupied herself with the cabin, grateful to feel useful. She mended her dress as best she could with supplies from Caleb's carefully organized sewing box. She baked bread in the cast-iron stove, using the last of his flour. She reorganized the shelves, dusted the sparse furniture, and read from his small but impressive library. On the third day, as she was examining the spines of his books, she found a small framed portrait tucked between two volumes. The painting showed a beautiful young woman with golden hair and delicate features. She wore a high-necked blue dress, and her expression was serious but gentle. Something about her eyes suggested intelligence and compassion. Her name was Elizabeth. Sarah startled, nearly dropping the portrait. She hadn't heard Caleb enter the cabin. He stood in the doorway, snow-dusting his broad shoulders, his expression carefully neutral. I'm sorry, she said, quickly returning the portrait to its hiding place. I shouldn't have pried. You weren't, he said, removing his coat and hanging it by the door. You were looking at books, not searching through my things. Still, Sarah felt she had stumbled upon something intensely private. Was she your wife? A shadow crossed his face. No. He offered nothing more, and Sarah didn't press. Instead, she moved to the stove where a pot of stew simmered. Dinner's nearly ready. They ate in companionable silence, the howl of the wind outside, making the warmth of the cabin seem all the more precious. After the meal, as Sarah washed the dishes, Caleb disappeared briefly outside, returning with something wrapped in oilcloth. I've been meaning to give you this, he said, setting the package on the table. Found it after I brought you here. Curious, Sarah dried her hands and unwrapped the parcel. Her breath caught in her throat. Inside was a silver hairbrush, her mother's hairbrush, miraculously intact. The handle was tarnished but still elegant, with her mother's initials engraved on the back. Where did you find this? She whispered, running her fingers over the familiar object. At your farm, Caleb said quietly, after the fire. Sarah looked up sharply. You were there, he nodded. I ride through Cedar Creek Valley, sometimes checking the lower pastures. Saw the smoke, but by the time I arrived, the house was mostly gone. He paused. I looked for survivors, found nothing but ashes and a few scattered items. That was in the yard, must have been thrown from a window. You saved this for a stranger, Sarah murmured, touched beyond words. Seemed important, he said simply. A person shouldn't lose everything. And my Bible? She asked suddenly. You said I was carrying it when you found me, but I don't remember having it after the fire. A flicker of something, guilt perhaps, crossed his face. Found that too. It was caught in a tree about 100 yards from where your house stood. Wind must have carried it during the blaze. He paused. When you collapsed on the trail, it fell. I recognized it from the farm. Why didn't you tell me earlier? Caleb's eyes met hers, gray and steady. You were barely holding together as it was. Thought it could wait until you were stronger. The simple thoughtfulness of the gesture brought unexpected tears to Sarah's eyes. This supposedly gruff, solitary man had taken the time to search through the wreckage of her life and save the few precious items he could find. More than that, he'd waited until she was ready to receive them, understanding instinctively that such gifts required the right moment. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Caleb shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to gratitude. It was nothing. But it wasn't nothing, and they both knew it. In that moment, something shifted between them. A first fragile tendril of connection, rooted in a shared understanding of loss. Later that night, as Sarah lay in Caleb's bed, listening to the wind howl outside, a sudden crack of thunder shook the cabin. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in stark white, followed immediately by another deafening boom. The unexpected storm in the midst of snow was disorienting, and Sarah sat up, wrapping the quilt around her shoulders. A strangled cry from near the fireplace caught her attention. Caleb was no longer in his bedroll. Instead, he crouched in the corner, his large frame curled inward, hands pressed against his ears. Another flash of lightning revealed his face, eyes wide, unseeing, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cabin's chill. Sarah approached cautiously, understanding instinctively that she was witnessing something deeply private and painful. "Mr. Stone," she called softly. "Caleb." He didn't respond, his breathing rapid and shallow, his body trembling. She knelt a few feet away, careful not to touch him. "You're safe," she said gently. "You're in your cabin at Stone Ridge. The war is over." His eyes flickered to her face, recognition slowly returning. "How did you know?" he rasped. "My father's brother came back from Gettysburg with similar troubles," she explained. "Loud noises, especially unexpected ones, would send him back to the battlefield." Another roll of thunder rattled the windows. Caleb flinched, his hands clenching into fists. Without thinking, Sarah reached for her Bible on the bedside table and opened it to the Psalms. She began to read, her voice soft but steady, creating a counterpoint to the storm's violence. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures, he leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul." She continued reading one psalm after another as the storm raged outside. Gradually, Caleb's breathing slowed, his posture relaxed, and his eyes focused on her face rather than some distant horror. "I was at Antietam," he said finally, his voice low and rough. "Saw 23,000 men die in a single day. The artillery, it sounded like this." Sarah nodded, continuing to read. She didn't offer platitudes or ask questions, understanding that her steady voice was an anchor tethering him to the present when memories threatened to drag him into the past. Eventually, the storm passed, leaving only the soft patter of snow against the windows. Caleb rose from his crouch, dignity reasserting itself in his straight spine and squared shoulders. "I apologize for disturbing your rest," he said formally. "There's no need for apology," Sarah replied, closing the Bible. "War leaves scars that don't show on the skin." He studied her face, perhaps searching for pity or judgment, but found only calm acceptance. "You should return to bed," he said finally. "Dawn comes early and there are chores to be done." Sarah hesitated, reluctant to leave him alone with the echoes of his memories. "Would it help if I continued reading for a while?" Something flickered in Caleb's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. He nodded once, settling back into his bedroll as Sarah returned to the bed Bible in hand. She read until her voice grew hoarse, long after Caleb's breathing had deepened into sleep. It was a small thing, this shared midnight vigil, but as Sarah finally set the Bible aside and curled beneath her quilts, she felt the first tentative stirrings of something that might in time become trust. The storm gave way to clear, bitter cold. For a week, Sarah and Caleb settled into an uneasy routine. During the day, they worked separately, Caleb outside with the livestock, Sarah tending to the cabin and cooking meals. In the evenings, they shared quiet dinners and occasional conversation, learning each other in the small, careful increments. Sarah discovered that Caleb had built the cabin himself 8 years ago after returning from the war. He'd worked as a carpenter before enlisting, and his skilled hands were evident in every joint and beam of the structure. He'd arrived with nothing but his tools, a horse, and determination, gradually building the prosperous ranch that now spread across several hundred acres. Caleb, in turn, learned that Sarah had attended Wellesley College before becoming a teacher, that she could recite Shakespeare from memory, and that she had an unexpected talent for chess, beating him soundly when they discovered a set tucked away on one of the shelves. They circled each other warily like dancers unfamiliar with the steps, neither willing to acknowledge the unresolved question that hung between them. What would happen when the snow melted and the trails cleared? On the 8th day, Caleb returned from checking his cattle with news. "Trail to Willow Creek is passable," he said as he shed his coat. "If you still want to go to town, we could ride out tomorrow." Sarah looked up from the shirt she was mending, her heart suddenly racing. This was it, the moment of decision. "And if I don't want to go to town?" Caleb's eyes met hers, steady and unreadable. "Then we need to discuss your proposal." She set the mending aside and straightened her spine. "I meant what I said. I believe we could build a good life together, Mr. Stone." "Caleb," he corrected. "If we're discussing marriage, you should use my given name." "Caleb," she repeated, the name feeling strange and intimate on her tongue. He settled into a chair across from her, his large frame making the furniture seem smaller by comparison. "Before I give you my answer, there are things you should know about me. Things that might change your mind." Sarah nodded, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. "I'm not an easy man to live with," he began. "I've been alone a long time, set in my ways. I have difficulties, as you've seen." He gestured vaguely, referring to the night of the storm. "The war left marks." "I understand," she said softly. "There's more." His jaw tightened. "I was engaged once to a woman named Elizabeth Montgomery. She was the daughter of the territorial governor, a teacher at a school for girls in Denver." His eyes drifted to the rocking chair near the fire. "I made that for her as a wedding present." "What happened?" Sarah asked when he fell silent. "There was an accident. A student drowned during a school outing. Elizabeth was in charge that day." His voice grew strained. "The girl's family blamed her. There was an investigation, though she was eventually cleared of wrongdoing. But Elizabeth, she couldn't forgive herself. She broke our engagement, said she didn't deserve happiness after what happened." "I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered. 3 months later, she took her own life. The words were flat, emotionless, but his hands clenched on the arms of his chair. She left a note saying she was going to join Clara, the student, and ask her forgiveness on the other side. Sarah's heart ached for the pain evident in every line of his body. "Is that why you came here, to escape the memories?" "Partly," he admitted. "Mostly I came because I couldn't stand being the man I'd become. Bitter, angry, blaming all and everyone else for what happened." He looked around the cabin. "Building this place, working this land. It saved me, gave me purpose when I had none." "And now?" Sarah asked quietly. Caleb's eyes returned to her face, gray and steady. "Now I'm offering you honesty before you tie yourself to a man with a damaged soul." He paused. "I can promise you shelter, protection, respect. I can promise to treat you as a partner, not a possession. But I can't promise to be the man you might have chosen in better circumstances." "I'm not asking for perfection," Sarah said, "only for a chance to build something meaningful from the ashes of what we've both lost." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Then he nodded once decisively. "I accept your proposal, Sarah Mae Chandler. I'll give you a home, and we'll see about those 10 sons." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, softening his stern features. "Though perhaps we might start with the one and work our way up." Relief and something like why flooded through Sarah. She hadn't realized how desperately she'd been holding on to this possibility until it became real. "When shall we marry?" "Soon," he said. "The weather could turn again any day. We should ride to Willow Creek tomorrow, speak to the preacher, arrange things properly." "Yes," Sarah agreed, thinking of her promise to her father. A proper marriage would fit in her duty to continue the Chandler line, even if the children would bear the Stone name. "I'd like that." That night, as they prepared for bed, Sarah in the narrow bed, Caleb in his bedroll by the fire, an awkward tension hung in the air. They had agreed to marry, yet remained physically separated by choice and propriety. Caleb, Sarah said softly as she slipped beneath the quilts, thank you for your honesty today, for trusting me with your past. In the firelight, his profile was strong and somber. You deserve the truth before making your decision. So do you, she replied. My father's last words to me were a request, a demand, really, to continue our family line. He made me promise not to let the Chandler name die with him. She swallowed hard. That's part of why I offered you 10 sons. It wasn't just about securing the place for Basitin. Caleb turned to look at her, his expression softening. You'll keep your promise, Sarah. Our children will know both their names and take pride in both their bloodlines. Our children, she repeated the words, sending an unexpected warmth through her chest. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something with the potential to grow into more. Like the first green shoot pushing through winter soil, fragile but determined. Sleep well, Caleb said, his deep voice gentle in the quiet cabin. Tomorrow we begin our future. Sarah closed her eyes, listening to the soft crackle of the fire and Caleb's steady breathing. For the first time since the night of the fire, she felt something close to peace settle over her. Whatever came next, she would face it not alone, but with this quiet, honorable man at her side. The ride to Willow Creek took most of the morning. Caleb had found a side saddle for Sarah among his stored items, though he avoided explaining why he owned such a thing. She wore her cleaned and mended dress, which was woefully inadequate for the bitter cold. Seeing her shiver, Caleb wrapped his spare coat around her shoulders before they set out. It was Elizabeth's, he said when she tried to refuse. She kept it here for visits. It would please her to know it's being used. The coat was fine wool, far better quality than Sarah's dress, and smelled faintly of lavender and cedar. Wearing it felt strangely intimate, like stepping into another woman's life. But it was warm, and Sarah was practical enough to set aside discomfort for survival. As they rode, Caleb pointed out landmarks and boundaries of his property. Stone Ridge spread across nearly 1,000 acres with grazing land for cattle hayfields, a small apple orchard, and timber-rich forests. It was an impressive achievement for one man working alone, and Sarah found herself admiring his determination and skill. How did you manage all this by yourself? She asked as they crested a hill that offered a view of the entire valley. Slowly, he replied with the ghost of a smile. One fence post, one field, one season at a time. It's remarkable, she said honestly. He shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. It kept me sane, gave me something to build when everything else had fallen apart. They lapsed into comfortable silence after that, each lost in private thoughts as they made their way toward town. Willow Creek appeared suddenly around a bend in the trail, a small but thriving community nestled in a protected valley. There were perhaps 50 buildings arranged along a main street with farms and smaller homesteads dotting the surrounding countryside. It's larger than I expected, Sarah commented as they approached. Railroad's coming through next year, Caleb explained. Town's been growing in anticipation. They've built a new school but haven't found a teacher willing to stay. Sarah's heart quickened at the mention of a school. She'd assumed her teaching days were behind her, but perhaps not. Do you think they might hire me? I think they'd be fools not to, Caleb said. But let's settle our own matters first. The church was a simple white clapboard building with a modest steeple. Beside it stood a small parsonage where the minister lived. Caleb helped Sarah dismount, his hands strong and steady at her waist, then tied their horses to the hitching post. Ready, he asked, offering his arm. Sarah took a deep breath and nodded, placing her hand in the crook of his elbow. They must have made an odd picture, the giant somber rancher and the slender woman in her soot-stained dress and borrowed coat. But Sarah lifted her chin and walked with dignity as they approached the parsonage door. The Reverend Daniel Roberts was a man of about 60, with kind eyes and a thoughtful manner. He invited them into his study, listening attentively as Caleb explained their situation, or a version of it that emphasized Sarah's status as a fire survivor and downplayed the unconventional nature of their arrangement. And you're certain this is what you both want? The minister asked, looking between them. Marriage is a sacred covenant not to be entered into lightly. We're certain, Caleb said firmly. Roberts turned his gentle gaze to Sarah. Miss Chandler, marriage is a lifetime commitment. If you're feeling pressured by circumstances, I'm not, Sarah interrupted, her voice steady. Mr. Stone has been nothing but respectful and honest with me. This is my choice. The minister studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. Very well. I can perform the ceremony this Saturday. That will give us time to post the banns and for you to make any necessary preparations. Thank you, Reverend, Caleb said, rising to shake the man's hand. As they left the parsonage, Sarah felt a curious mixture of relief and trepidation. In 3 days, she would become Mrs. Caleb Stone, a new identity to replace the one she'd lost in the fire. We should get you a proper dress, Caleb said, as they walked toward the general store. Something special for the occasion. The blue coat is fine, Sarah protested, conscious of her limited resources. No, he said gently but firmly. Every bride deserves a proper wedding dress, even if the circumstances aren't conventional. It's my gift to you. The general store was larger than Sarah had expected, with bolts of fabric, ready-made clothing, and all manner of household goods. The proprietor, a plump woman with a friendly manner named Mrs. Fletcher, took one look at them and immediately understood their mission. A wedding dress! How wonderful, she exclaimed, leading Sarah toward a selection of ready-made gowns, while Caleb waited near the front of the store, clearly uncomfortable with the feminine proceedings. Mrs. Fletcher pulled out several options. A cream-colored dress with delicate lace trim, a soft blue gown with pearl buttons, and a simple but elegant dress in dove gray. Sarah's hands went immediately to the gray dress. It was beautiful but practical, the kind of dress a rancher's wife might wear to church or special occasions long after her wedding day. That one, she said softly. Try it on, dear, Mrs. Fletcher urged, directing her to a small fitting room behind a curtain. The dress fit as if it had been made for her, the fabric draping perfectly over her slender frame. The color brought out the blue in her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt something close to pretty. When she emerged from behind the curtain, she found Caleb watching her, his expression unreadable but intense. You look beautiful, he said simply. Heat flooded Sarah's cheeks, but she managed a quiet thank you. While Caleb paid for the dress, refusing to tell her the price despite her protests, Sarah found herself drawn to a display of small household items, kitchen tools, linens, decorative objects that would make a house feel more like a home. See something you like, Mrs. Fletcher asked, coming to stand beside her. These, Sarah said, pointing to a collection of small clay pots perfect for starting flower seeds. Her mother had always kept flowers growing even in winter. How much? For a new bride, consider them a wedding gift, Mrs. Fletcher said warmly. By the time they left the store, Sarah had a new dress, the clay pots, and an invitation to tea from Mrs. Fletcher, who was clearly delighted to welcome a new lady to their community. Caleb had also quietly purchased several practical items: warm stockings, a proper winter coat, sturdy boots, and undergarments, all of which appeared in neatly wrapped packages loaded onto their horses. You didn't have to do all this, Sarah said, as they prepared to return to the ranch. Yes, I did, Caleb replied, helping her mount. You lost everything in that fire. It's only right that you start your new life with more than just the clothes on your back. The simple generosity touched Sarah deeply. This man, whom many in town clearly regarded with a mixture of respect and wariness, had considered her needs and met them without fuss or expectation of gratitude. It was another piece of the puzzle that was Caleb Stone. Stern and solitary on the surface, but capable of surprising thoughtfulness. On the ride home, they stopped at a small farm where Caleb introduced her to Thomas and Martha Miller, a middle-aged couple who would serve as witnesses at their wedding. The Millers welcomed Sarah warmly, insisting they stay for lunch and filling her in on the community she was joining. Stone Ridge is the finest spread in the county, Thomas said proudly, as if Caleb's success reflected well on everyone in the area. Built it all himself, he did, when most folks said that land was too remote to be workable. Thomas, Martha scolded gently, you'll embarrass the man with your fawning. But Caleb didn't appear embarrassed, only quietly pleased that his work was valued by his neighbors. Sarah watched the interaction with interest, noting how the Millers treated Caleb with genuine affection beneath their teasing. Whatever his reputation for solitude, he had earned the respect of at least some in the community. As they rode the final miles back to Stone Ridge, the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and rose. The beauty of it caught in Sarah's throat, a reminder that even in the depths of winter, there was still wonder to be found. It's magnificent, she breathed, reining in her horse to admire the view. Caleb stopped beside her, following her gaze to the sunset-washed peaks. It is, he agreed. That's part of why I chose this land. Some mornings when the light hits those mountains just right, He trailed off, perhaps embarrassed by the uncharacteristic poetry. It makes you remember there's more to life than just survival, Sarah finished for him. He glanced at her surprise and something warmer flickering in his gray eyes. Yes, he said softly, exactly that. They sat in companionable silence for a long moment, watching as the colors deepened and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Caleb pointed upward, tracing a pattern among the stars. Cassiopeia, he said, the queen. Sarah smiled, surprised by his knowledge. You know the constellations? My father taught me, he replied. He was a ship's navigator before settling down to carpentry. Said the stars were God's map for travelers. It was the first time he'd mentioned his family, and Sarah treasured this small offering of his past. My mother loved the stars too, she said. She used to tell me that when people die, they become stars watching over those they left behind. Caleb was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the heavens. I like that thought, he said finally, that they're still with us, still seeing our struggles and triumphs. As they continued toward home, and it was becoming home in Sarah's mind, she felt another small connection form between them. They were still strangers in many ways, but each shared confidence, each revealed piece of their past was another stitch in the fabric that might someday bind them together as truly as any marriage vows. That night, while Caleb checked on the livestock one final time, Sarah planted flower seeds in the small clay pots from Mrs. Fletcher. She placed them on the windowsill where they would catch the morning sun, patting the soil gently around each seed. My grandmother used to say that planting flowers was an act of faith, she said when Caleb returned stamping snow from his boots. You put seeds in the ground not knowing if they'll grow, trusting that with enough care and time, something beautiful will come of it. Caleb hung his coat by the door and came to stand beside her, looking at the neat row of pots. Sounds like a wise woman. She was. Sarah smiled at the memory. She also used to say that the best things in life, love, family, happiness, they all grow the same way, slowly with patience and tending. Caleb knelt beside her, his large hands gentle, as he helped press the last seeds into the dark soil. Then I reckon we're off to a good start. The simple statement spoken in his deep, quiet voice sent warmth spreading through Sarah's chest. They weren't in love, not yet, but they were planting seeds of something that might, with care and patience, grow into a kind of happiness neither had dared hope for after their respective losses. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah found herself looking forward to Saturday with an anticipation that surprised her. Whatever came after, she would no longer be alone. She would have a home, a purpose, and a man who, for all his shadows, treated her with a respect and consideration she hadn't expected when she'd made her desperate offer. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the promise of change and the sweet possibility of new beginnings taking root in ground that had lain fallow for too long. Saturday dawned clear and cold, the sun glittering off snow-covered fields with diamond brilliance. Sarah stood before the small mirror in the cabin, adjusting the dove-gray dress that would serve as her wedding gown. Her hands trembled slightly as she pinned up her hair, leaving a few soft curls to frame her face. She had been a bride once before in her girlhood dreams, walking down the aisle of her father's church in a white dress with flowers in her hair and love in her heart. The reality was very different. A practical arrangement born of desperation and necessity, a gray dress instead of white, a man she respected but didn't yet love. Yet as she smoothed the fabric over her hips and pinched color into her pale cheeks, Sarah felt a flutter of something like happiness. This might not be the wedding she had imagined, but it was a beginning, a chance to build a new life from the ashes of the old. Caleb had slept in the barn the previous night, insisting that it was bad luck to see the bride before the wedding. It was an unexpected bit of superstition from such a practical man, and it had made Sarah smile. Now he waited outside with the horses, giving her privacy to prepare. When she emerged from the cabin, Caleb's eyes widened slightly. He had traded his usual work clothes for dark trousers and a white shirt with a black vest that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. His hair was neatly combed and his beard trimmed. He looked like what he was, a successful rancher, a man of substance and respectability. You look beautiful, he said, the words simple but sincere. Thank you, Sarah replied, accepting his help to mount her horse. You clean up rather well yourself. The ghost of a smile touched his lips, a rare expression that transformed his stern features. Don't get used to it. Tomorrow it's back to work clothes and trail dust. I wouldn't have it any other way, she said, surprising herself with her own sincerity. The church was warm and welcoming, filled with the scent of pine boughs and beeswax candles. To Sarah's surprise, several pews were occupied. The Millers, of course, but also Mrs. Fletcher from the general store, the blacksmith and his wife, and several other townsfolk who had apparently heard about the wedding and come to witness the event. Word travels fast in small towns, Caleb murmured as they walked down the short aisle together. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful. Reverend Roberts spoke about the sacred nature of marriage, the importance of commitment, and the way two lives could become stronger when joined together. When the time came to exchange vows, Caleb's voice was steady and sure. I, Caleb James Stone, take you, Sarah Mae Chandler, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to provide for you, protect you, and honor you for all the days of my life. Sarah's voice trembled only slightly as she responded. I, Sarah Mae Chandler, take you, Caleb James Stone, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to be faithful to you, to support you, and to build a home with you for all the days of my life. The ring Caleb placed on her finger was simple gold, purchased the day before in town. As it slid into place, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of something that might grow into love given time and care. You may kiss your bride, Reverend R. Roberts said with a gentle smile. Caleb's kiss was soft and brief, respectful, rather than passionate, but it sent warmth through Sarah's entire body. When they broke apart, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Hope, perhaps, or the first stirring of genuine affection. The small gathering offered congratulations and well wishes. Martha Miller hugged Sarah and whispered that she was lucky to have found such a good man, even if he is too stubborn to show his feelings easily. Mrs. Fletcher pressed a small package into her hands, a set of handkerchiefs embroidered with SS Vaughan for her new initials. As they rode home in the late afternoon sunshine, both lost in their own thoughts, Sarah found herself studying the gold band on her finger. Mrs. Caleb Stone. It would take time to get used to the sound of that. Regrets? Caleb asked quietly. No, she said, surprised to realize it was true. You burned some. None. But that evening, as they settled into their new reality as husband and wife, the awkwardness between them was almost tangible. They moved around each other carefully like strangers sharing a small space. Caleb insisted Sarah keep the bed while he continued sleeping by the fire despite her protests that they were married now and should share sleeping arrangements. When we're shed, he said firmly, not before. Sarah didn't argue, recognizing the wisdom in his restraint. Their marriage had begun as a practical arrangement. Physical intimacy would come when emotional connection warranted it. For now, it was enough to know that she had a home, a name, and a man who respected her boundaries. As she lay in bed that night, listening to Caleb's steady breathing from his place by the fire, Sarah realized that for the first time since the night of her father's death, she was looking forward to tomorrow. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them not as a desperate homeless woman, but as Sarah Stone, wife, partner, and perhaps someday mother to the sons she had promised both her father and her new husband. Outside, the stars shone bright and clear, and Sarah imagined her parents among them watching over her with approval as she began this new chapter of her life. Winter settled into a rhythm at Stone Ridge, days blending together in a pattern of chores, meals, and quiet evenings. Sarah and Caleb found their way into a marriage that was more partnership than romance, but comfortable nonetheless. They worked side by side during daylight hours, tending livestock, repairing equipment, and preparing for the long, cold months ahead. Caleb proved to be a patient teacher, showing Sarah how to milk the cow, gather eggs from the temperamental hens, and mend harnesses with strong, even stitches. His hands were gentle when guiding hers through unfamiliar tasks, and his quiet, well done, meant more to her than effusive praise might have from another man. For her part, Sarah brought order and warmth to the cabin. She baked bread twice weekly, hung curtains fashioned from fabric Mrs. Fletcher had given them as a wedding gift, and rearranged furniture to create distinct spaces for cooking, dining, and relaxation. Small touches, a vase of dried pine cones on the table quilts folded neatly at the foot of the bed, herbs hanging to dry near the stove, transformed the functional shelter into something closer to home. Their evenings developed a comfortable routine. After dinner, they would sit by the fire, Caleb in his chair carving or reading, Sarah in a chair he had made for her mending, or writing in the journal he had given her as a wedding present. Sometimes they played chess or read aloud to each other from Caleb's collection of books. Other evenings passed in companionable silence, each content with their own thoughts. They were still navigating the boundaries of their unusual marriage, learning each other's habits and preferences with careful attention. Caleb continued to sleep by the fire, though he had built a proper bedstead for himself rather than using the bedroll. Sarah found herself both relieved and oddly disappointed by the arrangement. She respected his restraint, but sometimes wondered if he found her unattractive or undesirable. One evening in late January, as snow fell softly outside, Sarah finally gathered the courage to broach the subject. "Caleb," she began, setting aside her mending, "may I ask you something personal?" He looked up from the piece of wood he was carving, a small figure of a horse that was taking shape beneath his skilled hands. "Of course. Are you—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Are you content with our arrangement, with the nature of our marriage?" Caleb set his carving knife down carefully. "I am, if you are." "That's not an answer," Sarah said gently. He studied her face for a long moment, his gray eyes serious. "I'm content with how things are developing between us," he said finally. "I believe a strong marriage needs to be built on more than physical attraction. We're laying a foundation of trust and partnership first." "And later," she asked, her cheeks warming, despite her determination to have this conversation. "Later, when we both feel ready, we'll take the next step." His voice was steady, but she noticed his hands tighten slightly on the arms of his chair. "I won't press you, Sarah. What you offered, 10 sons, it was made out of desperation, not desire. I don't hold you to that timeline or expectation." "But you do want children." The question was important. Her promise to her father still weighed on her conscience. "Yes," he said simply, "when the time is right." Sarah nodded, relieved. "Thank you for your honesty." "Always," he replied, picking up his knife and returning to his carving. The conversation should have put her mind at ease, but that night as Sarah lay in bed listening to Caleb's steady breathing across the room, she found herself wondering what it would be like to be held in those strong arms, to feel his lips on hers, in more than the brief chaste kiss they had shared at their wedding. The thoughts were surprising in their intensity, and she pushed them away, reminding herself that she had married for practical reasons, not romantic ones. Still, as winter deepened and they grew more comfortable with each other, Sarah began to notice things about Caleb that stirred unfamiliar feelings. The way his face softened when he spoke of his horses or cattle, the gentleness in his hands when he helped a newborn calf find its mother's teat, the rare but transformative smile that came more frequently as the weeks passed, the breadth of his shoulders and the strength evident in every movement of his tall frame. These observations remained private, tucked away in her journal and in her heart. Whatever was growing between them needed time and space, like the flower seeds slowly sprouting in their pots on the windowsill. February brought a brief thaw, turning the snow-packed trails to mud and making travel possible again. Sarah had been corresponding with the school board in Willow Creek since shortly after their marriage, and an invitation had finally arrived for her to interview for the teaching position. "You should go," Caleb said when she showed him the letter. "You were a teacher before. It's part of who you are." "But there's so much work here," Sarah protested. "The garden needs planning and the chickens are finally laying well and I managed alone for 8 years before you came," he interrupted gently. "I can certainly manage 3 days a week while you're teaching. The school needs you more than the chickens do." The simple encouragement meant more to Sarah than he could know. Her father, for all his good qualities, had viewed her education as something to fall back on if she failed to marry well. He had never truly valued her intelligence or her passion for teaching. Caleb's easy acceptance of this part of her identity was a gift she hadn't expected. The interview was a formality. The school board was desperate for a qualified teacher before spring term began. They offered Sarah the position on the spot, 3 days a week at the new schoolhouse with a modest salary that would supplement the ranch's income. She would need to stay in town on Tuesday and Wednesday nights, given the distance to Stone Ridge, but Mrs. Fletcher had a spare room she was happy to rent for a reasonable price. Sarah rode home with her heart lighter than it had been in months. Teaching had always brought her joy, challenging her mind and allowing her to shape young lives. The prospect of returning to the classroom, of using her education and skills, filled her with renewed purpose. Caleb was waiting on the porch when she returned, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. He helped her dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. "Well," he asked, though her smile had already given away the news. "They hired me," she confirmed. "I start next week." "Of course they did." There was genuine pride in his voice. "They'd have been fools not to." That evening, as they sat by the fire discussing the practical arrangements her new position would require, Sarah was struck by how far they had come in the few months since her desperate arrival at his door. What had begun as a bargain for survival had evolved into a genuine partnership, with each supporting the other's needs and aspirations. "Thank you," she said, suddenly interrupting Caleb's explanation of the fastest route between the ranch and town. He looked up, puzzled. "For what?" "For encouraging me to teach again, for making space in our life for something that matters to me." Caleb's expression softened. "You don't need to thank me for that, Sarah. A good marriage is built on supporting each other's strengths, not limiting them." When the simple wisdom of his statement caught her by surprise. This man, whom many in town still regarded with wariness, had a deeper understanding of partnership than most. It was another piece of the puzzle that was Caleb Stone, stern and solitary on the surface, but thoughtful and surprisingly progressive underneath. Later that night, as Sarah prepared for bed, she noticed Caleb standing at the window, staring out at the starlit landscape with unusual intensity. "Is something wrong?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. "Just checking the weather," he replied, though his furrowed brows suggested otherwise. "Spring comes early to this valley sometimes. Need to be ready." Sarah sensed there was more he wasn't saying, but she didn't press. In their months together, she had learned that Caleb would share his thoughts when he was ready, not before. Instead, she placed a hand lightly on his arm, one of the few physical contacts they allowed themselves. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." He looked down at her, surprise and something warmer flickering in his gray eyes. "Yes," he said quietly, "I believe we will." Sarah's first day of teaching passed in a blur of new faces, lessons, plans, and the deep satisfaction of work that mattered. The schoolhouse was new, but simply furnished with rows of desks, a teacher's desk on a small platform, and a blackboard that spanned one wall. 15 students, ranging from 6 to 16 years of age, greeted her with varying degrees of curiosity and wariness. By the end of the day, she had learned all their names, assessed their academic levels, and begun to form a plan for the term ahead. The children were bright and eager to learn their families, a mix of farmers, shopkeepers, and tradespeople who valued education despite the frontier setting. Sarah stayed that night with Mrs. Fletcher, as arranged, enjoying the older woman's company and the chance to hear more about the community she was joining. The shopkeeper was a widow of 10 years who had taken over her husband's business and transformed it into the heart of Willow Creek's social life. "You've done wonders for Caleb Stone," Mrs. Fletcher commented as they shared tea after dinner. "We've all noticed the change in him." "What change?" Sarah asked, curious about how others perceived her husband. "He smiles now, for one thing." Mrs. Fletcher chuckled. "And he actually stopped to chat with Mr. Thompson last week instead of just nodding and moving on. For Caleb, that's practically a social revolution." Sarah laughed, recognizing the accuracy of the observation. "He's a private man, but not the hermit some believe him to be." "No, just wounded," Mrs. Fletcher said, her expression growing serious. "What happened with Elizabeth Montgomery nearly destroyed him. He blamed himself, though it wasn't his fault." "Blamed himself?" Sarah echoed, surprised. "But from what he told me, he wasn't even there when the accident happened." Mrs. Fletcher sighed. "He wasn't, but he believed he should have been. If he'd gone to Denver that weekend as planned instead of staying to help Thomas Miller with a barn raising, he might have been with Elizabeth during that school outing. Might have been able to save young Clara Wellington." Wellington. The name struck a chord of recognition in Sarah. As in Harrison Wellington, the railroad executive? "Clara was his sister," Mrs. Fletcher confirmed. 15 years younger, the apple of his eye. Her death nearly broke him, from what I hear. He left Denver afterward, couldn't bear to stay. Sarah absorbed this new information, adding it to the incomplete picture she had of her husband's past. Caleb had mentioned Elizabeth's death, but not his own feelings of responsibility, and he hadn't shared the connection to the Wellington family. "Why does Mr. Wellington blame Caleb as well?" she asked. "I wouldn't know," Mrs. Fletcher replied. "He's only been to Willow Creek once about a month ago, inspecting for the railroad. Didn't stay long enough for gossip to circulate." She patted Sarah's hand. "Don't fret, dear. These are old wounds. What matters is that Caleb has found happiness with you." Sarah nodded, but her mind was working rapidly, connecting threads of a story that seemed increasingly complex. She would need to find an opportunity to speak with Caleb about what she'd learned, to understand more about the shadows that still haunted him. But the opportunity didn't come immediately. Her second day of teaching was as busy as the first, and when she returned to Stone Ridge on Thursday evening, Caleb was preoccupied with a sick cow that required constant attention. By the time the animal was out of danger, both were too exhausted for serious conversation. Life settled into a new pattern with Sarah teaching Tuesday through Thursday and devoting the other days to ranch work alongside Caleb. The arrangement gave them both space for their individual pursuits while strengthening their partnership through shared responsibilities. Their evenings remained quiet but increasingly comfortable, the awkwardness of the early days fading as they grew more accustomed to each other's presence. One Saturday in early March, while Caleb was checking fence lines in the south pasture, Sarah decided to organize the storage shed behind the cabin. It was a task she had been meaning to undertake for weeks, hoping to create space for the garden tools they would need as spring approached. The shed was larger than it appeared from outside, well organized, but clearly used primarily for overflow storage rather than daily needs. Shelves lined the walls holding carefully labeled boxes of supplies, tools hung from pegs in precise arrangements, and larger items were stacked against the back wall. As Sarah worked her way through the space, she discovered a trunk tucked beneath a workbench. Unlike the other storage containers, this one bore no label. Curious, she opened it, finding women's clothing carefully wrapped in tissue paper, dresses, shawls, and other garments of fine quality. Elizabeth's things, she realized, preserved like artifacts of a life interrupted. Beneath the clothing lay a stack of books, mostly poetry and classics, with a small, leather-bound volume on top. Sarah opened it to find a journal, the pages filled with delicate handwriting. She should have closed it immediately, respecting Elizabeth's privacy even in death, but a sentence caught her eye. "She asked me to marry him today, and I said yes, though I fear I am not worthy of such happiness." Sarah closed the journal quickly, troubled by her invasion of this private record. Yet her curiosity had been piqued. What kind of woman had Elizabeth been? What insights might her journal offer into the man Sarah had married? Before she could wrestle further with her conscience, she noticed something else in the trunk. A wooden cradle partially assembled but unfinished. The craftsmanship was unmistakably Caleb's, with the same careful joinery and attention to detail evident in all his work. But unlike his other creations, this piece remained incomplete. The wood sanded smooth but not stained, the decorative elements outlined in pencil but never carved. The implications made Sarah's heart ache. Had Elizabeth been expecting a child when she died? Had Caleb lost not only his fiancée, but an unborn child as well? Her gaze fell on a wooden box beside the trunk, simple but elegantly crafted with a small brass clasp. Inside, she found dozens of letters, all addressed to Elizabeth in Caleb's neat handwriting, none of them sealed or stamped. She picked up the one on top, noting the date from just 6 months ago, years after Elizabeth's death. Sarah knew she should stop, close the box, return everything to its place. These were private communications never meant for her eyes. But the date troubled her. Why was Caleb still writing letters to a woman who had been dead for years? With trembling fingers, she unfolded the letter. "Dearest Elizabeth," it began, "the aspens are turning gold on the ridge, your favorite time of year. I thought of you this morning when the sun hit them just right, how you would have wanted to capture that light in one of your drawings." The letter continued, describing the changing season's work on the ranch, mundane details of daily life. It was not a lover's passionate declaration, but something more poignant. A one-sided conversation, as if Caleb were keeping Elizabeth informed of his life, despite her absence. The closing made tears spring to Sarah's eyes. "I hope you have found peace wherever you are. I still miss you every day, but the ache is duller now. I think you would approve of that. You always said I needed to learn to live in the present, not the past. I'm trying, Elizabeth. For you, and maybe now for myself as well. Always yours, C." Sarah carefully refolded the letter and returned it to the box, a wave of complicated emotions washing over her. There was sorrow for Caleb's loss, admiration for his loyalty, and, she had to admit, a twinge of something like jealousy. Not of Elizabeth herself, but of the depth of feeling Caleb had clearly held for her. Would anyone ever write to her with such devotion after she was gone? Would Caleb? She closed the box and returned it to its place, then continued her organization of the shed with more subdued energy. The cradle remained in her thoughts, its unfinished state a tangible representation of dreams, interrupted hopes, abandoned. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Sarah found herself watching Caleb more closely than usual. He was reading his strong profile illuminated by the firelight, seemingly at peace. Yet she now knew he carried deeper wounds than he had revealed, writing letters to a ghost and preserving a nursery that would never be used. "Caleb," she said softly, setting aside her mending. "May I ask you something?" He looked up from his book, a finger marking his place. "Of course," wished he. Sarah hesitated, uncertain how to broach the subject without revealing her discovery. "The shed behind the cabin, I was organizing it today." A flicker of something, alarm, crossed his face, but his voice remained steady. "Find what you needed." "Yes, but—" She took a deep breath. "I also found the cradle, the unfinished one." Caleb's face stilled, his expression shuddering closed. He closed his book and set it aside, his movements deliberate. "I see. You never mentioned a child," Sarah said gently. He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he sighed, a sound of profound weariness. "There wasn't a child, not yet, but Elizabeth had begun feeling unwell in the weeks before the accident. She hadn't confirmed it with a doctor, but we both suspected." He trailed off, staring into the fire. "I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered. "I started building the cradle as a surprise for when she was ready to tell me officially." His voice was flat and emotionless, but his hands clenched on the arms of his chair. "After she died, I couldn't bring myself to finish it, or to get rid of it." And the letters, the questions slipped out before Sarah could stop herself. Caleb's eyes snapped to hers, surprise and something like guilt flashing across his face. "You found those too?" It wasn't a question, but Sarah nodded anyway. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have looked." He was quiet again, gathering his thoughts. "After Elizabeth died, I found myself talking to her," he admitted finally. "It was comforting, I suppose. Eventually the talking became writing. Letters I never sent, couldn't send." He shrugged, a small, self-deprecating gesture. "I know it's not rational." "It's not about rationality," Sarah said softly. "It's about grief and love, and finding ways to continue a connection that was severed too soon." She hesitated, then added, "My mother used to write to my father when he was away on church business. She said that even if the letters never reached him, the act of writing helped her feel close to him." Caleb studied her face, perhaps searching for judgment or pity, but found only understanding. "The letters have become less frequent," he said. "I used to write every day then, every week. Now it's only occasionally when something reminds me particularly of her." "That's natural," Sarah assured him. "Grief changes shape over time, but it doesn't disappear entirely." "No," he agreed quietly. "It doesn't." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Sarah wanted to ask more. About Elizabeth's suspected pregnancy, about why he felt responsible for Clara Wellington's death, but sensed that Caleb had shared as much as he could for one evening. Some wounds needed to be revealed, slowly allowed to breathe before being examined too closely. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally, "for trusting me with this." Caleb nodded, his expression softening slightly. "You're my wife, Sarah. You deserve to know the man you married, shadows and all." The simple declaration touched her deeply. In acknowledging her right to know his past, Caleb was affirming the legitimacy of their marriage. Not just a practical arrangement, but a true partnership based on honesty and growing trust. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, listening to Caleb's steady breathing from across the room, she reflected on the layers being gradually revealed in this quiet, complex man she had married. Each discovery should have created more distance between them, reminders of his enduring connection to another woman. But instead, she found herself drawing closer, moved by his capacity for love and loyalty. Perhaps she thought, as sleep claimed her, there was room in his heart for new attachments alongside the old. Perhaps in time, he might come to care for her with something of the same depth he had felt for Elizabeth. It was a warming thought to carry into dreams. Sarah's third week of teaching brought an unexpected visitor to the schoolhouse. She was reviewing arithmetic with the younger children when the door opened, admitting a gust of March wind and a tall, distinguished-looking man in an expensive coat. He stood in the doorway for a moment, surveying the classroom with keen eyes before removing his hat. "Forgive the interruption," he said, his voice cultured and confident. "I was told I might find the teacher here." Sarah set down her chalk and straightened her spine. "I am Mrs. Stone, the teacher. How may I help you?" The man's eyebrows rose slightly at her name, a flicker of something. Recognition, surprise, crossing his handsome features. Mr. Stone, a pleasure to meet you. I am Harrison Wellington, Executive Director of the Frontier Railway and Land Company. A chill ran through Sarah that had nothing to do with the open door. This was the man whose sister had drowned under Elizabeth's supervision, the tragedy that had led to her suicide and Caleb's years of grief. Children, she said, keeping her voice steady, please continue with your problems while I speak with Mr. Wellington. She led him to the small anteroom that served as her office, closing the door partly but not completely. Propriety required she remain visible to the students. What can I do for you, Mr. Wellington? She asked, gesturing for him to take the single chair while she remained standing. I'm here on business related to the railroad, he explained, remaining standing as well. We're finalizing the route through this valley, and I make it a point to introduce myself to community leaders. The school teacher is always among the most important. It was a plausible explanation, but something in his manner made Sarah wary. There was an intensity to his gaze that seemed at odds with a routine business call. I'm still quite new to Willow Creek myself, she said carefully. I've only been teaching here for a few weeks. Yes, I heard you were recently married to Caleb Stone. Wellington's tone was casual, but his eyes sharpened. Stone Ridge is one of the larger properties in the area. Your husband must be doing well for himself. He is a hard-working man, Sarah replied, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. The ranch prospers under his care. Indeed. Wellington smiled, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. In fact, that's partly why I'm here. The proposed rail line would cross a corner of Stone Ridge. I'd like to discuss purchasing that section from your husband. We're prepared to offer a very generous price. Sarah's discomfort increased. Any business regarding the ranch should be discussed with Mr. Stone directly. Of course. Wellington waved a hand dismissively. But perhaps you could mention it to him. We're offering $100,000 for the southwest quarter of his property. A remarkable sum for land that's primarily used for grazing. The amount was staggering, more money than most people saw in a lifetime. Sarah kept her expression neutral with effort. I'll inform my husband of your interest. Wellington smiled again, this time with genuine satisfaction. Excellent. I'll call at Stone Ridge this weekend to discuss the details. He reached into his coat and withdrew a business card, placing it on her desk. Should your husband have any questions before then? As he turned to leave, he paused, studying her face with unsettling intensity. Forgive me, Mrs. Stone, but have we met before? You seem familiar, somehow. I don't believe so, Sarah replied, though something about him tugged at her memory as well, a vague sense of recognition she couldn't place. Perhaps not, he shrugged elegantly. In any case, I look forward to our next meeting. Good day, Mrs. Stone. After Wellington left, Sarah found it difficult to concentrate on the remaining lessons. The encounter had left her unsettled, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Was it simply his connection to the tragedy that had shaped Caleb's life? Or was there something more, something in his manner that triggered her instinctive wariness? And why would the railroad offer such an extravagant sum for a portion of Stone Ridge when there were surely easier routes through the valley? These questions occupied her thoughts for the rest of the day and during her stay at Mrs. Fletcher's that night. She considered asking the shopkeeper about Wellington, but decided against it. Whatever was happening, she needed to discuss it with Caleb first. When she returned to Stone Ridge on Thursday evening, she found Caleb in the barn repairing a broken harness with the focused attention he brought to all tasks. He looked up as she entered, his face softening in the way it always did when she returned from town. Welcome home, he said, setting aside his work and rising to help her with her bags. Thank you. She accepted his assistance, noting the way his hands lingered briefly on hers, one of the small physical connections they had begun to allow themselves. How was your week? Quiet, he replied. Yours? Sarah hesitated, uncertain how to broach the subject of Wellington's visit. Interesting, she said finally. I had a visitor at the school yesterday, Harrison Wellington. Caleb went utterly still, his face blanking of all expression. Wellington, he repeated the name flat and emotionless. Yes, he said he's with the Frontier Railway and Land Company. Sarah watched his face carefully. He mentioned wanting to purchase part of Stone Ridge for the rail line, offered a considerable sum. How considerable? $100,000 for the southwest quarter. Caleb's eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication of surprise on his otherwise impassive face. That's far above market value. I thought so too, Sarah agreed. He said he'd call here this weekend to discuss it with you directly. Caleb nodded once his jaw tight. Thank you for telling me. Caleb, Sarah said gently, I know who he is, who he was to Elizabeth and Clara. Mrs. Fletcher mentioned it. A muscle ticked in Caleb's cheek, but his voice remained steady. Then you understand why I'm not eager to do business with him. I do, she assured him, but I thought you should be prepared before he arrives. I appreciate that. He picked up the harness again, clearly considering the conversation over. But Sarah wasn't finished. There's something else, she said. Something about him seemed, I don't know, wrong somehow. He asked if we'd met before, said I looked familiar. Caleb looked up sharply. Had you met him before? Not that I recall, though something about him did seem vaguely familiar. She shook her head, frustrated by the elusive memory. It's probably nothing. Maybe, Caleb said, but his expression had grown troubled. Stay away from him if you can, Sarah. Wellington may seem charming and civilized, but there's something cold in him, especially since Clara's death. He's not a man I trust. The warning was unnecessary. Sarah had already decided she wanted nothing to do with Harrison Wellington. Still, Caleb's evident concern touched her. Whatever his lingering feelings for Elizabeth, he clearly cared about Sarah's welfare. I'll be careful, she promised, but I want to be here when he comes. This is my home too now, and any decision about the ranch affects us both. Caleb studied her face, perhaps measuring her determination. Then he nodded, a hint of approval in his gray eyes. Partners in all things, he agreed. As it should be. The simple acknowledgement warmed Sarah more than she expected. In the months since their marriage, they had built a functional partnership based on mutual respect and shared work. But this was something more, recognition that major decisions about their future should be made together, not dictated by one over the other. That night, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Caleb was unusually quiet, his expression distant. Sarah gave him space, occupying herself with mending until he was ready to speak. The southwest quarter, he said, finally staring into the flames. It's not just grazing land. Sarah set her sewing aside. What do you mean? There's a spring there hidden in a grove of aspens. The water comes straight from the mountain, pure and sweet. It's what makes this ranch viable, even in the driest summers. He looked up, meeting her eyes. Without it, the rest of the property would be worth half what it is now. And Wellington wants that specific section, Sarah said slowly, understanding dawning. He's not just buying land for a rail line. No, Caleb agreed grimly. He's trying to devalue the entire ranch. Force me to sell the rest for a fraction of its worth once the water source is gone. But why? Surely there are easier routes for the railroad ones that wouldn't require such manipulation. Caleb shook his head. I don't know, but Wellington isn't a man who acts without purpose. There's something more happening here. Sarah considered the situation, turning it over in her mind. Could it be personal because of what happened with Clara and Elizabeth? Perhaps, Caleb admitted, though it's been 8 years and he's never shown any interest in Stone Ridge before. What will you do when he comes? Refuse his offer, Caleb said simply. Whatever game he's playing, I won't be part of it. They lapsed into silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the coming confrontation. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Wellington's sudden interest in Stone Ridge than either of them understood. Something beyond business or even personal vendetta. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah found herself staring at her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin. Wellington had said she seemed familiar. Why she had lived in Boston before returning home to care for her parents, had never visited Denver or the Colorado Territory until after the fire. There was no reason for their paths to have crossed. Yet something about him had triggered a sense of recognition in her as well. Not his face specifically, but something in his manner, his bearing. It hovered just beyond the reach of memory, like a word on the tip of her tongue. She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the more immediate concern of his upcoming visit. Whatever Wellington wanted, she and Caleb would face it together. The thought was reassuring, a reminder that she was no longer alone in the world. Saturday dawned clear and cold, with a biting wind that hinted at one last winter storm before spring truly arrived. Sarah rose early, determined to have the cabin at its best for Wellington's visit. Not out of any desire to impress him, but rather to present a united front. Stone Ridge is a functioning, prosperous ranch with owners who were firmly established and not easily intimidated. She baked fresh bread, swept the already clean floors, and put on her best dress, the dove gray one from their wedding. Caleb raised an eyebrow when he saw her preparations but made no comment. He too dressed with unusual care, wearing the same clothes he had worn to their wedding. Together they projected an image of quiet prosperity and confidence. Wellington arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, driving a sleek black carriage pulled by matching bay horses. He was impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than most people in Willow Creek earned in a year. His silver-streaked dark hair and neatly trimmed beard giving him an air of distinguished authority. He was not alone. A younger man accompanied him, thin and nervous-looking, with wire-rimmed spectacles and an armful of documents. "My secretary, Mr. Abernathy," Wellington explained, as Caleb invited them inside. Sarah served coffee while the men settled at the table, maintaining a polite but reserved demeanor. She noted the way Wellington's eyes cataloged every detail of their home. The solid furniture, the neat arrangement, the small touches of comfort and civilization. Something like approval flickered across his face before his expression returned to pleasant neutrality. "A charming home," he commented. "You've done well for yourself, Stone." "We're content," Caleb replied, his voice even. "Now I understand you have a business proposition." Wellington smiled, appreciative of the direct approach. "Indeed, as I mentioned to your wife, Frontier Railway and Land Company is interested in purchasing the southwest quarter of Stone Ridge for our new rail line. We're prepared to offer $100,000, an extremely generous price for undeveloped land." "It's not undeveloped," Caleb corrected calmly. "That section contains prime grazing land, a creek, and a spring that waters half the ranch. All of which we've factored into our valuation," Wellington assured him. "I assure you, Mr. Stone, you won't find a better offer." "I'm not interested in selling," Caleb said firmly. "Not that section or any other part of Stone Ridge." Wellington's smile didn't falter, but something hardened in his eyes. "I'd urge you to reconsider. The railroad is coming to this valley whether individual landowners cooperate or not. Progress doesn't wait for stubborn ranchers who can't see the bigger picture." "My husband has made his position clear, Mr. Wellington," Sarah interjected, disliking the implicit threat in his words. "Stone Ridge is not for sale." Wellington turned his attention to her, studying her face with that same unsettling intensity he had shown at the schoolhouse. "Mrs. Stone, forgive me, but I didn't catch your maiden name during our previous meeting." "Chandler," she replied, puzzled by the change in subject. "Sarah May Chandler." A flash of recognition crossed Wellington's face, quickly masked. "Chandler. From Cedar Creek, perhaps?" Sarah stiffened. "Yes, my family had a farm there." "Had? It burned down this past winter." Wellington made a show of sympathy. "How terrible, these frontier homesteads are so vulnerable to fire. One careless moment with a lantern, one spark from a chimney." He trailed off suggestively. Something cold settled in Sarah's stomach. There was knowledge in Wellington's eyes, a calculated awareness that suggested. "The fire wasn't an accident," she said slowly, the words forming as realization dawned. "You knew about it." "How?" Wellington waved a dismissive hand. "News travels even in these remote areas. I merely—" "You've never been to Cedar Creek," Caleb interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet. "It's nowhere near any proposed rail line. You had no reason to know about a farm fire in an isolated valley unless you had a specific interest in it." A tense silence fell over the cabin. Wellington's pleasant mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something hard and cold beneath. Then the smile returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You're making quite an accusation, Mr. Stone," he said softly. "Based on what my awareness of local events, a reasonable businessman stays informed about the territories where he operates." "Why are you really here, Wellington?" Caleb demanded. "This isn't about a rail line. There are easier routes through the valley that wouldn't require purchasing prime ranch land." Wellington studied them both, his expression calculating. Then he sighed, setting his coffee cup down with deliberate care. "Very well. Since we're abandoning pretense, let me be direct." He turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Stone, or should I say Miss Chandler, we have indeed met before, though you were using your professional name at the time. Sarah May, the school teacher at Newberry Academy for young ladies in Boston." Sarah's breath caught. Newberry Academy. She had taught there for 2 years before her mother's illness called her home. But she had never met Harrison Wellington during that time, she was certain of it. "I don't recall," she began. You wouldn't, Wellington interrupted. We were never formally introduced, but my daughter Eliza was briefly in your care. A quiet girl easily overlooked. You reported her for cheating on an examination, resulting in her expulsion. The memory clicked into place. Eliza Wellington, a sullen, privileged girl who had been caught with answers written on her cuff during a Latin examination. Sarah had indeed reported her to the headmistress, as was her duty. The girl had been dismissed from the school despite her family's protests and attempts to bribe the administration. I remember Eliza, Sarah said carefully, but I never met you during that time. No, but I saw you, Wellington replied, his voice hardening, at the headmistress's office providing your damning testimony. You ruined my daughter's prospects with your self-righteous adherence to rules that the wealthy and powerful have always been able to circumvent. I did my duty, Sarah said, her chin lifting. Eliza cheated. The consequences were clear and applied equally to all students. Wellington's laugh was cold and brittle. How naive. The world doesn't work that way, Mrs. Stone. Those with power make the rules and break them as needed. Those without power, like a mere school teacher, should know better than to challenge their betters. This is absurd, Caleb cut in, his expression darkening. You're saying all this, the offer for Stone Ridge, your sudden interest in a remote ranch, is because of a school disciplinary matter from years ago. Not entirely, Wellington admitted, his gaze shifting to Caleb. Let's say it provided additional motivation for a business decision I was already considering. His smile turned predatory. You see, Mr. Stone, your wife isn't the only one in this room with a connection to my past. You and I have unfinished business as well. Clara, Caleb said, understanding dawning. This is about Clara and Elizabeth. Indeed. Wellington's voice was soft, almost gentle, but his eyes were cold as winter frost. My sister drowned while under the care of your fiancé. An accident, they called it. But I've never believed in accidents, Mr. Stone. Elizabeth Montgomery was negligent at best, criminally irresponsible at worst. The investigation cleared her completely, Caleb argued. Clara wandered away from the group against explicit instructions. Elizabeth did everything she could to save her. Too little, too late. Wellington snapped his composure, cracking briefly. He took a breath, visibly calming himself. But we needn't revisit old wounds. Let's return to the matter at hand. He motioned to his secretary, who produced a document from his portfolio. This is a final offer for the southwest quarter of Stone Ridge, Wellington said, sliding the paper across the table. Consider it carefully before refusing. The railroad has many ways to acquire the land it needs, some more pleasant than others. Is that a threat? Caleb asked, not touching the document. Wellington smiled thinly. Merely a statement of fact. Progress cannot be stopped, Mr. Stone. You can profit from it or be crushed beneath its wheels. The choice is yours. Get out, Caleb said quietly, rising to his full height. Get out of my house and off my land. Wellington didn't appear intimidated by Caleb's imposing figure. He rose calmly, adjusting his cuffs with fastidious care. As you wish, but do consider my offer. You have 1 week to accept before it's withdrawn. He nodded to Sarah, his expression coldly pleasant. Mrs. Stone, a pleasure to renew our acquaintance, however indirectly. Sarah remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. She didn't trust herself to speak, too many emotions churning beneath her composed exterior. Caleb escorted Wellington and his secretary to the door, his movements stiff with controlled anger. Once the visitors had departed, he stood at the window watching until their carriage disappeared around the bend in the road. He's not finished, Caleb said, his voice tight. That was just the opening move. Sarah rose on unsteady legs and moved to stand beside him. I don't understand. How could he possibly know I was here? That we were married? It can't be coincidence. It's not, Caleb agreed grimly. He's been planning this, gathering information. The question is why? What does he really want with Stone Ridge? Sarah's mind was racing, trying to connect the scattered pieces of this puzzle. Wellington clearly harbored grudges against both her and Caleb. Petty in her case, more substantial in Caleb's. But was personal vengeance enough to explain his determined pursuit of their land? There must be something more, she said slowly. Something about this particular property that he's not revealing. Caleb nodded, his expression troubled. Whatever it is, we need to be prepared. Wellington didn't build his empire by accepting defeat easily. Sarah placed a hand on his arm, drawing strength from his solid presence. What should we do? First, we verify his claims, Caleb said decisively. Check if the railroad really has plans for this valley, or if that's just a convenient excuse. Then we look into Wellington himself, his business, his methods, his true motives. How? We need to go to Denver, Caleb replied. That's where Wellington's company is headquartered, where the territorial records are kept. If there's something hidden about Stone Ridge or Wellington's interest in it, that's where we'll find it. The prospect of such a journey was daunting. Denver was several days' travel, and they would need to leave the ranch under someone else's care. But Sarah recognized the necessity. Whatever game Wellington was playing, they needed to understand the rules before they could hope to win. When do we leave? She asked. Caleb's expression softened slightly as he looked down at her appreciation for her ready partnership evident in his eyes. Monday, he said. You'll need to make arrangements with the school, and I'll ask Thomas Miller to check on the livestock while we're gone. Sarah nodded, her mind already organizing the necessary preparations. We'll find answers, she said with more confidence than she felt. Whatever Wellington is planning, we'll face it together. Caleb's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, warm and reassuring. Together, he agreed. Looking up at his stern profile, Sarah felt a surge of something powerful and unexpected. Not just partnership or gratitude, but a deeper emotion she wasn't quite ready to name. Whatever came next, whatever Wellington intended, she and Caleb would stand united against it. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising one last winter tempest before spring's arrival. Inside, Sarah and Caleb Stone prepared for a different kind of storm, one that threatened not just their land, but the future they had begun to build together. The journey to Denver took 3 days of hard travel. They left Stone Ridge at dawn on Monday after making arrangements with Thomas Miller to watch over the ranch and with the school board to excuse Sarah's absence for at least a week. The weather held, though the spring mud made the trails treacherous, in places slowing their progress. They rode in companionable silence, for much of the way, each lost in their own thoughts about Wellington's threats and their uncertain future. At night, they camped beneath the stars, or when available, took rooms at roadside inns, always separate accommodations, maintaining the careful physical distance that had defined their marriage thus far. Yet something had shifted between them since Wellington's visit. The shared threat had broken down certain barriers, creating a new intimacy born of common purpose and mutual concern. Sarah found herself studying Caleb when he wasn't looking. The strong line of his jaw, the breadth of his shoulders, the surprising gentleness in his hands when he helped her dismount or passed her a plate at their campfire. She was beginning to see the man beneath the stern exterior, and what she discovered only deepened her respect and growing affection. For his part, Caleb seemed more attentive to her comfort, more inclined to share his thoughts rather than brooding in silence. He pointed out landmarks as they traveled, told her stories of his early days in the territory, and asked thoughtful questions about her teaching experiences. It was as if the crisis had given him permission to reach beyond the restraint that usually governed his behavior. On the evening of the third day, they crested a hill and saw Denver spread before them in the valley below. A bustling city of nearly 20,000 souls, with brick buildings, church spires, and the smoke of industry rising against the backdrop of the mountains. It's larger than I expected, Sarah commented, reining in her horse beside Caleb's. It's grown, he replied. Last time I was here, it was half this size. There was something in his voice, reluctance perhaps, or wariness, that caught Sarah's attention. When was that? She asked. 8 years ago, he said quietly, just after Elizabeth died. Sarah nodded, understanding his hesitation. Denver held painful memories for him, the place where he had lost his fiancée, where he had last seen Elizabeth alive. We don't have to stay long, she assured him, just long enough to find what we need. Caleb's expression softened as he looked at her, appreciation evident in his gray eyes. It's different this time, he said. I'm not alone. The simple statement warmed Sarah more than she expected. She reached across the space between them and placed her hand briefly on his arm, one of the small physical contacts they had begun to allow themselves. No, she agreed, you're not alone anymore. They rode into the city as twilight fell, the streets crowded with wagons, carriages, and pedestrians hurrying home from work. Denver pulsed with energy and purpose, the frontier rawness Sarah had expected softened by signs of established civilization. Gaslights along the main streets, elegant storefronts, a theater advertising the latest play from New York. Caleb led them to a modest hotel near the center of town, the kind that catered to business travelers rather than tourists. "We'll start at the territorial offices tomorrow," he said as they checked in. "Land records first, then the Railroad Commission." Sarah nodded, too exhausted from the journey to formulate more detailed plans. They agreed to meet for breakfast at 7, then retired to their separate rooms, adjacent but not connecting, maintaining propriety even in their urgency. Alone in her room, Sarah unpacked her small bag and prepared for bed, her mind still churning with questions about Wellington and his interest in Stone Ridge. What could he possibly want with their land that justified such elaborate machinations? Was it truly just revenge for perceived wrongs, or was there something more valuable at stake? She fell asleep with these thoughts circling in her mind, only to dream of fire. The Chandler farm burning, her father trapped inside, and a shadowy figure watching from the tree line, satisfaction evident in his stance, even as his face remained obscured. The territorial offices occupied an imposing stone building in the heart of Denver. Inside, the scent of old paper and dust hung in the air, and clerks moved between towering shelves of records with the unhurried pace of bureaucracy everywhere. Caleb approached the main desk, where a thin man with ink-stained fingers looked up from his ledger with barely concealed irritation. "We need to examine the original homestead records for Section 12, Township 15 North, Range 68 West," Caleb said, producing his own papers as referenced. The clerk sighed dramatically. "That'll take some time to locate. You'll need to wait." They settled on a hard bench in the waiting area, prepared for delay. "How did you acquire Stone Ridge?" Sarah asked quietly, realizing she had never heard the full story of how Caleb had come to own his land. "Bought it from a man named James McAllister," Caleb replied, his voice equally low. "Met him in a saloon here in Denver 8 years ago. He'd staked a claim, but decided the land was too remote, too difficult to work. Sold it to me for a fraction of what it's worth now." "And you've improved it substantially since then," Sarah observed. Caleb nodded. "Built everything from the ground up. The cabin, the barn, the fencing. Cleared fields, dug irrigation ditches." There was pride in his voice, the satisfaction of a man who had shaped his world with his own hands. "It's remarkable what you've accomplished," Sarah said sincerely. Before Caleb could respond, the clerk returned with a thick folder. "Section 12, Township 15 North. These are the original filings." Caleb's hands were steady as he opened the folder, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. The first document was a homestead claim filed by James McAllister, dated June 15, 1865. The signature looked authentic, the paperwork properly notarized. But tucked behind it was another document that made Caleb's face go very still. A death certificate for James McAllister, dated March 3, 1863, 2 years before the homestead claim was filed. "Someone filed this claim using a dead man's name," Sarah whispered, the implications instantly clear. "And I bought it from them 8 years later, thinking I was dealing with the original claimant." Caleb's voice was bitter with self-recrimination. "I was a fool." "You were trusting," Sarah corrected gently. "There's a difference, you're." The clerk was watching them with undisguised curiosity. "Problem with your paperwork." "You could say that," Caleb replied grimly. "What happens when a homestead claim is proven fraudulent?" "Well, the land reverts to territorial ownership and can be claimed by the next legitimate applicant." The clerk scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Of course, that's assuming someone files the proper challenges and can prove their case in court." "And who filed the challenge to this claim?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. The clerk consulted another record book. The Frontier Railway and Land Company filed their papers last month, along with a new claim for the same section. Sarah felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Wellington hadn't just discovered a flaw in their ownership, he had orchestrated this entire situation. "How long do we have before the land officially transfers to them?" "Hearing scheduled for next week," the clerk said. "If the current occupant, that'd be you, I reckon, doesn't appear to contest the challenge, the transfer becomes automatic." "And what would we need to contest it successfully?" Caleb asked, his voice level despite the devastating news. "Proof that you have a superior claim to the land, or evidence that the Frontier Company's challenge is itself fraudulent?" The clerk shrugged. Either way, you'd need a lawyer and considerable documentation. They left the territorial offices with the weight of this new knowledge pressing down on them. Wellington had laid his trap carefully, ensuring that his challenge to their ownership appeared legitimate on paper. Even if they contested it, the evidence was damning. The original claim had indeed been fraudulent, though Caleb had purchased it in good faith. We need to understand what Wellington really wants, Sarah said as they walked toward their next destination, the Railroad Commission. If it's just revenge, there are simpler ways to hurt us. This is too elaborate, too calculated. Caleb nodded, his expression grim. You're right. There's something more valuable at stake than just grazing land or water rights. The Railroad Commission offices were housed in a newer building a few blocks away. Unlike the territorial offices, these rooms hummed with activity, clerks rushing between desks, surveyors consulting maps, officials conferring in hushed tones. It took some persuasion, but they eventually secured an appointment with a junior commissioner named Howard Parker. Parker was a harried-looking man in his 40s with spectacles that kept sliding down his nose and a desk buried under stacks of papers. Stone Ridge, he repeated when Caleb explained their purpose. That's in Willow Creek Valley, correct? Let me check our proposed routes. He rifled through several drawers before producing a large map, which he spread across his desk. Here we are, Willow Creek Valley. He traced a line with his finger. The primary route under consideration runs here well south of your property, Mr. Stone. There's an alternate route that would clip the very southern edge, but it's not the preferred option due to terrain challenges. So there's no definite plan to build through Stone Ridge? Sarah asked, exchanging a glance with Caleb. Not at present, Parker confirmed, though plans do change as surveys are completed and land is acquired. And who makes those decisions? Caleb inquired. About route changes, I mean. The board of directors votes on major route alterations based on recommendations from the chief engineer. Parker adjusted his spectacles. For this section, that would be, let me see. He consulted another document. Mr. Harrison Wellington. He's acting as both director and chief engineer for the Willow Creek segment. Sarah felt a chill run through her. Wellington had positioned himself to control every aspect of the railroad's expansion through their valley. Thank you for your time, Mr. Parker, she said, rising to leave. You have been most helpful. Outside, they paused on the sidewalk, processing this new information. The railroad doesn't even want our land, Sarah said quietly. That was just a pretext. Which brings us back to the original question, Caleb replied. What does Wellington really want with Stone Ridge? I think I know someone who might help us answer that, Sarah said after a moment's thought. Mrs. Fletcher mentioned that Wellington has only visited Willow Creek once about a month ago, but someone must have helped him gather information about the valley, about us. Someone local. Caleb considered this. The surveyor, he said suddenly. There was a survey team in the valley last fall mapping for the railroad. They camped near Miller's place for nearly 2 weeks. Could they have been looking for something besides a rail route? Sarah suggested. It's possible, Caleb agreed, and Denver would be the place to find the survey team's reports. They spent the rest of the day tracking down the survey company that had contracted with the railroad. By late afternoon, they found themselves in a small office near the edge of town, facing a grizzled former prospector named Silas Morgan, who had led the Willow Creek survey. Sure, I remember that job, Morgan said, stroking his beard thoughtfully. Unusual one it was. Normally, when we're surveying for rail lines, we're looking at grades, soil stability, water crossings, that sort of thing. But Mr. Wellington had special instructions for that valley. What kind of special instructions? Caleb asked. Wanted us to take soil samples every quarter mile. Deep ones, too, not just surface soil. Morgan shrugged. Said it was for foundation stability, but that didn't make much sense to me. We don't dig that deep for rail beds. Sarah leaned forward. Did you find anything unusual in the samples? Morgan's eyes narrowed slightly. What's your interest in this, if you don't mind my asking? Stone Ridge is our ranch, Caleb explained. It's in Willow Creek Valley. Wellington's been trying to acquire part of our land, claiming it's needed for the railroad. Understanding dawned on Morgan's weathered face. Stone Ridge. That was the section that we spent the most time on, the southwestern quarter especially. He hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Look, I'm not supposed to share client information, but something about that job never sat right with me. We found traces of gold in several of the samples from your property. Not surface deposits, but indications of a potentially significant vein deep below. Sarah and Caleb exchanged startled glances. Gold, Caleb repeated. You're certain? Morgan nodded. I was a prospector for 20 years before I turned to surveying. I know gold when I see it. The assay confirmed it. Low grade but extensive. The kind that requires industrial mining, not panning or simple shaft mining. And Wellington knows about this, Sarah asked. He received all our reports, Morgan confirmed. Paid extra for expedited results too. The pieces were falling into place. Wellington didn't want their land for a railroad at all. He wanted what lay beneath it. The water rights had been a convenient explanation, but the real prize was far more valuable. Thank you, Mr. Morgan, Caleb said, rising to shake the surveyor's hand. You've been extremely helpful. As they left the office, Sarah's mind was racing. That explains the excessive offer, she said. $100,000 would seem generous for ranch land, but it's nothing compared to what a gold mine would yield. And when we refused to sell, he resorted to challenging our ownership directly. Caleb added, his jaw tight with anger. You sting a fraud that he likely orchestrated himself. What do you mean? Think about it, Caleb said grimly. 8 years ago, I meet a man in a Denver saloon who sells me land using the identity of someone who died 2 years earlier. Now, coincidentally, Wellington discovers this fraud and uses it to claim the land. It's too convenient. Sarah's eyes widened as she followed his reasoning. You think Wellington was behind the fraudulent sale from the beginning, that he set you up 8 years ago? It would explain a lot, Caleb replied. Why the seller knew so many details about the property. Why the paperwork looked authentic enough to pass initial inspection. Wellington has connections in the territorial offices. He could have arranged the false claim years ago, planning to reclaim the land once its true value was discovered. But why go to such lengths? Why not simply stake a claim fee on unclaimed land? Because Stone Ridge wasn't unclaimed, Caleb explained. It had been surveyed and registered years earlier, but abandoned during the Civil War when the original owner enlisted. By creating a false claim in a dead man's name, then selling it to an unsuspecting buyer like me, Wellington created a situation he could exploit later if needed. And he chose you specifically, Sarah realized, because of Elizabeth, because he already blamed you for Clara's death. Caleb nodded, his expression darkening. It would be like him to plan such elaborate revenge. Clara's death changed him according to those who knew him before, made him colder, more calculating. They had reached their hotel, both lost in thought about these revelations. In the lobby, they were surprised to find Thomas Miller waiting for them, his expression troubled. Thomas, Caleb greeted him with concern. What are you doing in Denver? Looking for you, Dallas, Miller replied. Something's happened at Stone Ridge. There was a fire in the south pasture near the spring. Burned about 20 acres before we could contain it. He hesitated. It wasn't an accident, Caleb. We found coal oil cans and footprints. Someone set it deliberately. Sarah felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. Wellington was escalating, moving from legal threats to physical intimidation. Was anyone hurt? She asked. No, thank the Lord, Miller assured her. But it was a close thing. If the wind had been blowing toward the cabin instead of away from it, Caleb's face had gone hard as stone. When did this happen? Night before last, Miller said. Right after you left for Denver. There's more. Cynthia Marsh at the general store said a man matching Wellington's description was asking questions about you both in town last week. Wanted to know your schedule when you'd be away from the ranch. Sarah and Caleb exchanged grim looks. Wellington wasn't just trying to take their land through legal chicanery. He was willing to destroy it, and possibly them, if necessary. We need to return to Stone Ridge immediately, Caleb said decisively. Tonight if possible. The trails are dangerous in the dark, Miller cautioned. And there's a storm brewing. Best wait until morning. Caleb looked as if he might argue, but Sarah placed a hand on his arm. Thomas is right, she said gently. We'll leave at first light. A few hours won't make a difference now, and we'll travel faster if we're rested. After a moment's hesitation, Caleb nodded. First light, he agreed. They secured a room for Miller and arranged to meet in the lobby before dawn. As they walked toward their own rooms, Sarah sensed the coiled tension in Caleb's body, the barely contained fury at this attack on their home. We'll stop him, she said quietly. Now that we know what he's really after, we can fight back more effectively. Caleb's expression softened slightly as he looked down at her. You're remarkably calm about all this. Not calm, Sarah corrected. Determined. There's a difference, I found. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. So there is. He hesitated outside her door. Try to rest, Sarah. Tomorrow will be a long day. You as well, she replied, reluctant to part from him even for the night. Something had shifted between them during this journey, a deepening of trust, a strengthening of their partnership that went beyond their practical arrangement. As she prepared for bed, Sarah found herself thinking not just of Wellington's threats, but of the man who stood beside her facing them. Caleb's quiet strength, his unwavering determination to protect what he had built, his evident concern for her safety. All these qualities had come into sharper focus during their investigation. She realized with a clarity that both surprised and didn't surprise her that what she felt for her husband had evolved beyond respect and partnership. When exactly it had happened, she couldn't say. Perhaps gradually over shared meals and quiet evenings, or perhaps in moments of revelation like their discoveries today. But the truth was undeniable. She was falling in love with Caleb Stone. The recognition should have been frightening, given the uncertainties they faced. Instead, it filled her with a sense of rightness, of purpose. Whatever came next, they would face it together, not just as partners, but as two people whose lives and hearts were becoming increasingly intertwined. With this comforting thought, Sarah finally drifted into sleep, her dreams, for once, free of fire and shadows. They left Denver at dawn, riding hard through a landscape beginning to green with early spring. The journey back to Stone Ridge would normally take 3 days, but urgency drove them to press on longer each day, stopping only when darkness made the trails treacherous. Sarah matched Caleb's grueling pace without complaint, understanding his need to return to the ranch he had built with his own hands. Thomas Miller rode alongside them and offering what information he could about the fire and its aftermath. The damage had been contained to the south pasture, but the message was clear. Wellington was escalating from threats to action. On the evening of the second day, they camped in a sheltered grove beside a small stream. After a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, Miller excused himself to check on the horses, leaving Sarah and Caleb alone by the campfire. "We're making good time," Sarah observed, trying to ease the tension that had settled over Caleb since they'd left Denver. "We should reach Stone Ridge by midday tomorrow." Caleb nodded, his eyes fixed on the flames. "I keep thinking about what Wellington might do next," he admitted. "The fire was just the beginning. If he's willing to destroy property, what else might he attempt?" "We have evidence now," Sarah reminded him. "The fraudulent claim, the survey results showing gold deposits. Once we expose his true motives, his leverage disappears." "Evidence only matters if someone in authority is willing to act on it," Caleb replied grimly. "Wellington has influence throughout the territory. Judges, officials, lawmen. Many owe him favors or fear his power." "Then we go above them," Sarah said with sudden inspiration. "The territorial governor. From what Mrs. Fletcher said, Governor Montgomery, Elizabeth's father, is still in office. Surely he would listen, given your history with his daughter." Caleb's expression clouded. "Montgomery and I didn't part on good terms. After Elizabeth died, he blamed me for not being there, for not preventing what happened." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "But you're right. He's our best hope for justice. And he's a good man despite our differences. He wouldn't condone Wellington's methods." Sarah reached across the space between them and took his hand, a gesture more intimate than their usual careful touches. "Then that's our next step after we secure Stone Ridge. We'll gather our evidence and request an audience with the governor." Caleb looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. "You're remarkable, Sarah Stone," he said softly. "Most women would have fled at the first sign of trouble, not ridden across the territory pursuing justice." "I'm not most women," she replied with a small smile. "And Stone Ridge is my home now, too. I won't surrender it without a fight." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, a softening, a warming that transformed his features. Without releasing her hand, he moved to sit beside her on the fallen log she'd claimed as a seat. Their shoulders touched, a simple contact that nonetheless sent warmth coursing through Sarah's body. "When I asked you to marry me," she said quietly, "it was a practical arrangement, a way for both of us to survive." She hesitated, gathering her courage. "But it's become something more to me." "You've become something more." Caleb's hand tightened around hers. "Sarah," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," she assured him quickly. I know you still carry Elizabeth in your heart, and I would never ask you to carry Sarah, he interrupted gently. Look at me. She raised her eyes to his heart pounding. What I felt for Elizabeth was real, he said softly. I'll always honor her memory. But these past months with you, he paused, searching for words. You've brought life back to Stone Ridge, back to me. I never expected to feel this way again, never thought I deserved to. And how do you feel? Sarah asked, barely breathing. Instead of answering with words, Caleb leaned forward and kissed her. Not the brief, chaste kiss of their wedding, but something deeper, warmer, filled with emerging feelings, too complex for simple expression. Sarah responded without hesitation, her free hand rising to rest against his cheek, feeling the rough texture of his beard beneath her palm. When they finally parted, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. Does that answer your question? He murmured. Sarah smiled, joy unfurling in her chest despite the dangers that still awaited them. Yes, she whispered. Yes, it does. The sound of footsteps announced Miller's return, and they separated slightly, though their hands remained linked. If Miller noticed the change between them, he had the grace not to comment, merely settling on the other side of the fire with a contented sigh. That night, as they prepared for sleep, Caleb arranged his bedroll beside Sarah's. Not touching, but closer than they had slept since their marriage began. The simple proximity was both comfort and promise, an acknowledgement that whatever had been growing between them had finally been recognized and embraced. As Sarah drifted toward sleep, she felt Caleb's hand reach for hers in the darkness, their fingers intertwining beneath the stars. For all the uncertainties that lay ahead, this one truth remained constant: they would face them together, their partnership now strengthened by deeper bonds of emerging love. They reached Stone Ridge shortly after noon the following day. The damage from the fire was immediately visible: a swath of blackened earth in the south pasture, the charred remains of fence posts, and the acrid smell of smoke still hanging in the air. Caleb's face hardened as he surveyed the destruction, but he said nothing, spurring his horse toward the cabin. Everything else appeared untouched. The cabin stood solid and welcoming, the barn and outbuildings intact, the livestock grazing peacefully in the north pasture. Martha Miller had clearly been caring for things in their absence. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the windows gleamed in the spring sunshine. Thank you both for watching over our home, Sarah said sincerely as they dismounted in the yard. We're in your debt. Neighbors help neighbors, Thomas replied simply. That's how we survive out here. Martha emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. Welcome home, she called. I've kept the stove going, and there's stew simmering for your dinner. The simple domestic gesture, having food waiting after their journey, brought unexpected tears to Sarah's eyes. This was home now, truly home, in a way that transcended mere shelter or legal ownership. The thought of losing it to Wellington's machinations was suddenly viscerally painful. After the Millers departed, promising to return the next day to help assess the fire damage more thoroughly, Sarah and Caleb entered the cabin together. It was exactly as they had left it, yet somehow different, changed by their absence and returned by the knowledge of threats against it, by the evolution of feelings between them. I need to check the spring, Caleb said after setting down their bags. Make sure the fire didn't damage the water source. I'll come with you, Sarah offered, unwilling to be separated from him even briefly. They walked together to the southwestern corner of the property, where a grove of aspens surrounded the natural spring that was Stone Ridge's most valuable resource. The fire had stopped short of the trees, though the scorched earth came within yards of the grove. It was deliberate, Caleb said, kneeling to examine the blackened ground. The fire started here upwind of the spring. If it had reached the trees, the root system could have been damaged, potentially affecting the water flow. Wellington is trying to devalue the property, Sarah observed. Make it less productive, force us to sell. Or drive us away entirely, Caleb added grimly. Next time it might be the barn or the cabin itself. Sarah shivered despite the warm spring air. We need to be prepared for anything. Caleb straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. I'll start tonight. Extra water barrels in case the spring is compromised. Firearms loaded and ready, one of us awake at all times. Like being under siege, Sarah murmured. That's exactly what we are, Caleb confirmed. Until we can bring our evidence to the governor, we need to protect what's ours. The next few days fell into a tense pattern. Caleb reinforced doors and shutters, positioned extra water barrels around the property, and taught Sarah how to use the shotgun and rifle they kept in the cabin. They took turns keeping watch at night, catching sleep in shifts, always alert for any sign of intruders. Thomas Miller spread word among their neighbors about Wellington's threats, and several local ranchers began taking turns riding patrol along the boundaries of Stone Ridge. The community's support was heartening, a reminder that not everyone could be intimidated or bought by Wellington's wealth and influence. Sarah continued teaching, unwilling to abandon her students despite the crisis. Caleb insisted on accompanying her to and from Willow Creek on those days, unwilling to let her travel alone, while Wellington's intentions remained threatening. Their new closeness was evident to those who knew them well. Mrs. Fletcher commented on the change with approval, noting that they finally looked like a proper married couple instead of polite strangers. On Thursday evening, as they rode home from town together, Sarah noticed a rider approaching from the direction of Stone Ridge. As the figure drew closer, she recognized the distinctive uniform of a territorial marshal. "Marshal Blackwood," Caleb greeted the man with cautious respect. "What brings you to Stone Ridge?" Marshal James Blackwood was a weathered man in his 50s with a reputation for fairness, but also for avoiding conflict with powerful interests. He tipped his hat to Sarah before addressing Caleb. "Mr. Stone, Mrs. Stone, I'm afraid I'm here on official business." He produced a document from his coat. "This is a summons to appear before Judge Wilson in Denver next Tuesday regarding the ownership dispute over your property. The Frontier Railway and Land Company has accelerated their challenge based on new evidence." "What new evidence?" Sarah demanded, taking the document from his outstretched hand. "That's for the judge to determine," Blackwood replied. "But I should warn you, Wellington has powerful friends in the territorial courts, Judge Wilson among them." "So you're saying the hearing is just a formality," Caleb concluded, his voice hard, "that the decision is already made?" Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "I'm saying proceed with caution, Stone. Wellington isn't a man who loses gracefully." He hesitated. "There's something else you should know. There's been talk in town, rumors that the fire in your south pasture wasn't Wellington's first act of persuasion." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, a cold dread settling in her stomach. "The Chandler farm fire," Blackwood said, not meeting her eyes. "Some are saying it wasn't an accident, that Wellington had business interests in Cedar Creek that Samuel Chandler was opposing. Nothing proven, mind you, just talk." Sarah felt as if the ground had dropped away beneath her. Her father's death, the loss of her home. Could Wellington have been responsible? The timing fit. Her father had been vocal about opposing outside development in their valley, had organized other farmers to resist selling their water rights to a company she now realized must have been connected to Wellington. "My father was inside that house," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If Wellington set that fire." "Like I said, it's just rumors." Blackwood backpedaled quickly. "I shouldn't have mentioned it without proof." But Sarah could see in his eyes that he believed the gossip to be true. Wellington had a history of removing obstacles by whatever means necessary. Her father had been an obstacle. The fire that had claimed his life had been convenient for Wellington's plans, just as the fire at Stone Ridge had been calculated to damage their most valuable resource. "If you have any evidence," Caleb said to Blackwood, his voice tight with controlled anger, "anything at all that connects Wellington to the Chandler fire, we need it for the hearing." "I don't have evidence," Blackwood admitted, "just whispers. Wellington's too careful for that." He adjusted his hat nervously. "I should be going. Remember Tuesday at 10 o'clock, Denver Courthouse." After the marshal rode away, Sarah and Caleb continued toward home in silence, each processing this new information. For Sarah, grief mingled with a growing rage. If Wellington had indeed been responsible for her father's death, then this fight was no longer just about Stone Ridge. It was about justice for her family. "We'll need to leave for Denver on Sunday," Caleb said finally as they approached the cabin. "That gives us 2 days to prepare our case and gather whatever evidence we can." Sarah nodded, her mind already working through possibilities. "We should speak with Silas Morgan, again get a formal statement about the survey findings. And we need to locate the man who sold you the property, the false McAllister. He might be willing to testify about Wellington's involvement." "It's a long shot," Caleb cautioned. "Even if we find him, he'd be implicating himself in fraud." "We can offer immunity," Sarah suggested. "Surely the territorial prosecutor would agree if it meant exposing Wellington's larger scheme." Caleb glanced at her with something like admiration. You would have made a fine lawyer, Sarah Stone. Despite everything, she smiled. Perhaps in another life. In this one, I'm content to be a teacher and a rancher's wife. She reached across the space between them to touch his hand. We will win this, Caleb, whatever it takes. His fingers curled around hers, warm and reassuring. Together, he agreed. That night, after a simple dinner, they sat by the fire discussing strategy for the upcoming hearing. The practical conversation gradually gave way to more personal reflections as the weight of the day's revelations settled over them. If Wellington really was responsible for the Chandler fire, Sarah said quietly, then our paths were destined to cross from the beginning. His actions drove me to Stone Ridge to you. A connection neither of us could have foreseen, Caleb observed. Perhaps there's a justice in that his attempt to destroy your life led you here to help defend against his next attack. Sarah considered this. My grandmother used to say that God works in patterns too large for us to comprehend, that sometimes what seems like tragedy is merely the first thread in a tapestry whose design we can't yet see. A comforting thought, Caleb said, though I've struggled to see purpose in some of life's darker moments. As have I, Sarah admitted. When my father died, when I lost everything, it was difficult to imagine any possible good emerging from such loss. She looked up at him, her heart in her eyes. But now sitting here with you, I can begin to see the pattern forming. Caleb rose from his chair and came to kneel before her, taking both her hands in his. Sarah, he said, his voice rough with emotion, whatever happens with the hearing with Wellington with Stone Ridge, I want you to know that meeting you has been the greatest blessing of my life. You've brought light back into a world I thought would remain forever in shadow. Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes. And you've given me a home when I had none purpose, when I was adrift. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Together, he agreed and sealed the promise with a kiss that spoke of commitment beyond legal documents, beyond practical arrangements. A bond formed in adversity and strengthened by growing love. That night, for the first time since their marriage, Sarah and Caleb shared the bed, holding each other through the dark hours, finding comfort in proximity as they faced the uncertainties ahead. Nothing more intimate transpired between them. Both sensed that such developments should wait until the threat to their home was resolved. But the simple act of sleeping in each other's arms marked another threshold crossed in their evolving relationship. Morning found them more rested than either had expected, despite the weighty decisions that awaited them. After breakfast, they began preparations for the journey to Denver, organizing documents and planning their strategy for the hearing. A knock at the door interrupted their work. Caleb answered it, hand instinctively near the pistol at his hip, only to find Thomas Miller standing on the porch, his expression urgent. Wellington's in town, Miller announced without preamble. Arrived this morning with two men who look more like hired guns than businessmen. They're asking questions about your schedule when you plan to leave for Denver. Caleb's face hardened. He's planning something. That's not all, Miller continued. Martha was at the general store when they arrived, overheard Wellington talking to his men about making an example in unfortunate accidents. He knows about the hearing, Caleb, and I don't think he intends for you to reach Denver. Sarah joined them at the door, having heard everything. He's going to try to stop us, she said, stating the obvious conclusion. Ambush us on the road, perhaps. Or worse, Caleb agreed grimly. If we don't appear at the hearing, the judgment will default in his favor. Stone Ridge would be his without contest. We need to leave now, Sarah decided. Take an alternate route to Denver, one he wouldn't expect. Through the high country, Caleb nodded. It's longer but less traveled. We could be halfway there before he realizes we've gone. They moved with practiced efficiency, gathering only essential supplies and the documentation they would need for the hearing. Within an hour, they were mounted and ready to depart, taking a little-used trail that led east through the foothills rather than the main roads south toward Denver. Thomas Miller promised to spread word that they were still at the ranch, planning to leave the following day as expected. The deception might buy them valuable time, allowing them to travel unmolested through the wilderness routes that Caleb knew from his early days in the territory. The journey was arduous, the spring trails muddy and often obstructed by fallen trees or rock slides from the winter thaws. They pushed on regardless, making camp only when darkness made further progress impossible, and rising before dawn to continue their journey. On the second day, as they navigated a narrow pass between towering cliffs, Sarah noticed Caleb growing increasingly alert. his eyes scanning the rocks above them with evident concern. "What is it?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "We're being followed," he replied, barely audible over the sound of their horses' hooves. "Since mid-morning, two riders keeping their distance but matching our pace." Sarah resisted the urge to look back. "Wellington's men." "Most likely," Caleb agreed. "They must have figured out our route sooner than we expected." "What do we do?" "Though," Caleb considered their options. "There's a fork ahead. The left path leads to a box canyon. No exit except the way in. The right continues toward Denver." "You want to split up," Sarah realized, reading his intent. "I'll take the left fork, draw them into the canyon," Caleb confirmed. "You continue to Denver, get to the hearing. Even if I'm delayed, your testimony and the documents should be enough to at least postpone Wellington's claim." "No," Sarah said firmly. "We stay together." "We agreed." "Sarah," Caleb began, his tone gently persuasive. "No," she repeated. "There's another way. We both take the left fork, let them follow us into the canyon. Once they're committed to the path, we can double back, trap them inside instead." Caleb studied her face, weighing her suggestion. "It's risky," he said finally. "If they realize what we're doing before they're fully in the canyon." "It's less risky than separating," Sarah insisted. "Please, Caleb, trust me on this." After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "Together, then." And when they reached the fork, they turned left without hesitation, spurring their horses to a faster pace, as if eager to make up time. The path narrowed as it wound between steep rock walls, eventually opening into a natural amphitheater surrounded by sheer cliffs, the box canyon Caleb had described. They rode about halfway into the canyon before Caleb signaled a halt. "We wait here," he said quietly, dismounting and helping Sarah from her horse. "Let them commit to the path before we make our move." They didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls. Two riders appeared at the entrance, hesitating briefly before continuing forward. As they drew closer, Sarah recognized one as Wellington's Secretary Abernathy. The other was a stranger, rough-looking and heavily armed, clearly hired muscle rather than administrative support. "Now," Caleb whispered, swinging back onto his horse in one fluid motion. They burst from their hiding place behind a large boulder, riding hard toward the canyon entrance. The sudden movement startled their pursuers, whose horses reared in alarm. By the time Wellington's men had regained control, Sarah and Caleb had already thundered past them, the narrowness of the path preventing any attempt to block their exit. "They're trapped until they can turn their horses around," Caleb called as they reached the fork and took the right path toward Denver. "That should buy us some time." Sarah glanced back, a relief washing over her as she saw no immediate pursuit. "Do you think there are others?" "Possibly," Caleb admitted. "But Wellington wouldn't have expected resistance. He's used to people capitulating to his demands." "Then he doesn't know who he's dealing with," Sarah replied with grim satisfaction. They rode hard for the rest of the day, avoiding the main trails and keeping to less traveled routes where ambush would be difficult. By nightfall, they had covered significant ground, though they were still a full day's ride from Denver. "We should reach the city by tomorrow evening," Caleb said, as they made camp in a sheltered grove. "The hearing is the following morning. Cutting it close, but we'll make it." Sarah nodded her thoughts, already turning to their presentation for the judge. "Even if Wellington's influence extends to Judge Wilson, we have evidence of fraud and manipulation. Surely that counts for something in a court of law." "It should," Caleb agreed, though his tone suggested doubt. "But Wellington has been operating this way for years without consequence. The law doesn't always apply equally to men of his wealth and position." "Then we appeal to a higher authority," Sarah said determinedly. "Governor Montgomery may have had his differences with you, but he's known for his integrity. If Judge Wilson rules against us despite the evidence, we take our case directly to the governor." Caleb's expression softened as he looked at her across their small campfire. "Your faith is remarkable, Sarah. Injustice in the system. In me." "Not faith," she corrected gently. "Determination. There's a difference." His smile was brief but genuine. "So you've said before." They settled into their bedrolls side by side, too exhausted for further discussion, but drawing comfort from each other's proximity. Tomorrow would bring them to Denver and the confrontation they had been preparing for since Wellington's first visit to Stone Ridge. Whatever the outcome, they would face it as they had faced every challenge since their paths crossed in that snowy forest months ago, together partners in adversity as in all things.